بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي كان موجودا قبل حدوث الأشياء ويبقى بعد فناء الأشياء تفرد بالأولية والقدم وسما كل شيء ما عداه بالفناء والعدم كما قال عز شأنه كل شيء هالك إلا وجهه وكل نفس ذائقة الموت وقال كل من عليها فان ويبقى وجه ربك ذو الجلال والإكرام سبحان من لا يخفى عليه اختلاف النيات ولا يعزب عنه معاصي العباد في الخلوات سبحان الله الذي منه خلقه العباد وإليه المعاد فمن يعمل مثقال ذرة خيرا يرى ومن يعمل مثقال ذرة شرا يرى نشهد أن لا إله إلا هو الملك الذي لا ينازع في ملكه ولا يضاد في حكمه يعذب من يشاء بما يشاء كيف يشاء ويرحم من يشاء بما يشاء كيف يشاء تعذيبه المسيء عدل وعفوه تفضل ونشهد أن محمدا سيد المرسلين وخير المبشرين والمنذرين صلى الله عليه وآله الهداة المهديين من ركب سفينتهم نجا واهتدى ومن تخلف عنها ذل فغرق وهوى أوصيكم عباد الله بالاعتصام بالتقوى فإنه حبل متين وعروة الوثقى قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقان الحميد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فاسألوا أهل الذكر إن كنتم لا تعلمون آمنا بالله وصدق الله العلي العظيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Our discussion has been on the fundamental doctrine of Islam, which is Tawheed, and the call of Rasulillah, which says, Qulu la ilaha illallah tuflihu. And we have discussed quite a few principles as well as perspectives in this matter. And our current discussion is on the ita'at of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we are discussing the third category, which is Ahlul Dhikr. And having discussed the first two, that is obedience to Rasulillah and obedience to the Ahlul-bayt alayhimus salam, we are now on our discussion of the universal principle of ask those who know, to learn from the knowledgeable ones. Last week, we discussed briefly the principle of man being created with needs in this life, and at the same time that Allah is the provider of all these needs, all fulfillment of these needs. Whilst the fulfillment of the needs may evolve, the basic needs remain the same. And therefore, we discussed a few aspects that even guidance is a basic need of human beings, and that Allah is one who has provided guidance for human beings from the onset of man's creation. Human beings have been created with certain inherent qualities, amongst which is to be guided towards the truth, the love of knowledge, the sense of thankfulness, and the prevention from harm. And therefore, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent us His books, His scriptures, His prophets, His messengers, the Aimma alayhimus salam, for correct guidance. At the same time, He gave us the capability by giving us intellect, that is aql. Now, as we said briefly last time, when the need of revelation ended, when Allah says, Al-yawma akmaltu lakum dinukum, the need for revelation ended. However, need for guidance did not end, and therefore the silsila or the chain of Imamate began, which did not bring any new religion, but showed us practically on how to follow the deen that was brought to us by none other than Rasulillah Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Similarly, when this chain of Imamat, from the starting point where Rasulillah appointed explicitly the Imamate of Amir al-Mu'mineen Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi wa salamu alayk, and his 10 sons up to the 11th Imam continued, whereby for a period of 250 years there was a Ma'sum Imam amongst the people where people could interact directly with the Imam. However, in Allah's infinite wisdom, the 12th Imam, the Imam of our time, Imam Al-Hujjat Jalallahu Ta'ala Farajahu Sharif, was to have his first part of Imamate in Ghaybat. And this first part is also divided into two, and thereafter when he reappears, he will establish justice and equity. And during this period of Ghaybat, there is a need for guidance as well, like it has always been, and therefore Allah created the system of having the knowledgeable ones amongst us whom we will interact with. Of course, these ulamas are not ma'asum, and thus they are directly under the umbrella of the Ma'sum Imam of our time. Whilst in the time of Rasulillah, all matters of religion as well as political and social issues were directly under Rasulillah. During the time of the Aimma alayhimus salam, they were the guides. It is time during this successor's Ghaybat, the 12th Imam's Ghaybat, that we see that there is a change. Before we go into what this Ghaybat is and how we are to follow and why the two separate Ghaybat that is there, the Sughra and the Kubra, let us look at a very important principle of Imamate. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Baqarah says, Inni ja'iluka linnasi imama. So first and foremost principle of Imamate is that Allah divinely appoints an Imam. It is not somebody who is made by people, whether by election, selection, whatever name we can give it. It is a divine appointment, because Allah says, Inni, surely I am the one who has appointed you as the Imam. And like all previous Imams, the 11th Imam, Imam Hassan al-Askari salawatullahi wa salamu alayk, introduced the next Imam that is after him. However, the main difference is that all the other 11 Imams were publicly introduced. The introduction of the Imam of our time was not made public. It was done to selective individuals. And there are a few narrations of how many people and when and the incidents that came about where the Imam of our time was introduced by the 11th Imam. We will very shortly and briefly look at one particular incident, which is the incident of Ahmed Ibne Ishaaq, who was a very close companion of the 11th Imam and was known for his piety, trustworthiness, and God-fearing nature. He once went to Imam to inquire about the Imam after him. However, when he came in the presence of the Imam, and before he could ask this question, Imam addressed him and said, O Ahmed ibn Ishaaq, the Almighty Allah, now there is a principle that Imam is also presenting here. He says, the Almighty Allah has not left the earth without a divine proof, a hujjah, since the creation of Adam alayhi salam, and would never leave it without a divine proof, a hujjah, till the hour shall be established, that is the day of judgment. Through the divine hujjah, calamities are repelled. Because of the presence of the hujjah of Allah, calamities are repelled from the inhabitants of the earth. Rain falls and bounties of the earth come out. So Ahmad thus asked, Ya Imam, who is the Imam and Khalif after you? Imam arose from his seat and hurried inside the house and returned after a very short break, whilst in such a way that upon his neck and shoulders sat a boy, which is described in history as whose face seemed to be like the full moon, And it seemed that he was about 3 years old. And after that, Imam addressed Ahmed again and said, "O Ahmed, if you were not having a special and exalted position before Allah and the proof of Allah, that is Himself, I would not have shown this son of mine to you." His name and his patronym, his title, is the same as that of Rasulillah Muhammad Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And he will fill the earth with justice and equity as it would be fraught with injustice and oppression. O Ahmad, in this community, his example is like that of Khizr and Dhul Karnain. And we will discuss this part of the hadith some other time, inshallah. By Allah, he will have an occultation, and none shall be safe from destruction but one whom Allah has kept steadfast in the belief of his Imam and given him the divine tawfiq to pray for his reappearance. After the martyrdom of Imam Hassan al-Askari alayhi salam, the imamate of our Imam of our time, Imam Al-Hujjat jarallahu ta'ala farajahu sharif, began. The imamate was different from all other imams, since he was, by the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, required to go into two separate and distinct occultations. These two parts are divided into the first, which is the first 69 years after 260 Hijrah up to about 329 Hijrah, which is called Ghaybate Sughra, the minor occultation, and the period after 329 Hijrah unto date and until he makes his reappearance is known as Ghaybate Kubra, the major occultation. After his reappearance, yes, he will establish justice and he will establish equity and he will establish the kingdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on land. And he will fill the earth with justice and equity. The first 69 years, that Shias could still contact the Imam through direct representatives that the Imam himself appointed, which we know as the four Naib Khas, the four specific, specially appointed agents. After the 329 Hijrah period, there are no such agents who are directly appointed. To explain the difference, the first occultation is known as the lesser occultation, the minor occultation, Ghaybate Sughra or Ghaybate Kathira. Whereas the second period is described as the major, greater, Kubra or Tawila. Now, why was it a Ghaybat or Sughra? Why was it there? It is a period of transition. As we have discussed before, all the Imams prepared the Mu'mineen for the period of Ghaybah of the Imam, starting from the very first one. However, the later Imams, the 9th, 10th and 11th Imams, gave special importance and emphasized this new phase of guidance. And although the Imams prepared Mu'mineen for this era of guidance of the learned scholars, there was a need for a practical situation to be given so that Mu'mineen can comprehend what it is like to be in the Ghaybah of the Imam. And therefore this transition period from the infallible Imam to the non-infallible ulama, there has to be a transition, and that transition was the 69 years period of Ghaybate Sughra. For 250 years after Rasulullah's departure, Mu'mineen were used to contacting the Imam of their time. However, there was going to be a shift from this. So therefore, the four naib that were specifically appointed came one after the other. This was a link from the people to the Imam. They were a direct link from people to Imam. And of course, there were other agents of the Imam during that time, but they had limited jurisdiction. not compared to these four. And these were one after the other. They were not all four in the same time as far as their rank and responsibility is concerned. Among the duties of these Naib Khas was to forward questions of the Mu'mineen to the Imam and convey their answers back to the people. And also amongst the responsibilities was to collect the various hukuk funds, that is homes, zakat and all other hukuk funds, and distribute them as the Imam saw fit, as well as other duties. These four Naib, just the names for today inshallah, is the first one was Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Amiri, also known as Abu Amr. The second one was Muhammad ibn Uthman bin Sa'id, who was his son, or known as Abu Ja'far. The third is Hussein ibn Raw al-Nawbakhti, known as Abu Qasim, the one whom we address when we send our Arida on the 15th night of Sha'ban. And the fourth one was Ali ibn Muhammad al-Samiri, known as Abu Hassan. Inshallah, we will discuss a few aspects of their responsibilities so that we may understand what the duties of the mu'mineen are during this time. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the tawfiq to be able to comprehend the teachings of the Aimma alayhimus salam and implement them in our lives. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي لا إله إلا هو الحليم الكريم غافر الذنب وقابل التوب وهو الغفور الرحيم. سبحان من سبقت رحمته غضبا وبسط اليدين بالرحمة. سبحان من لم يكلف نفسا إلا دون وسعها وأفى عن السيئات ولم يجاز بها. سبحان من لا يزداد ولا معاصي لعباد الله كرما وجودا ولا كثرة الذنوب إلا عفوا وصفحا. نشهد أن لا إله إلا هو العطوف على العباد بجودي والأواد والمذنبين بحلمي. ونشهد أن محمدا نبيه وحبيبه سيد المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين بعثه رحمة للعالمين صلى الله عليه وآله الداعين إلى سبيل الله بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة قادة الأمم وأولياء النعم ومعدن الرحمة. Mu'mineen, for the last 2 weeks we have been discussing a few aspects about Islam after Rasulillah's departure from this world. We discussed as a baseline so that we may understand the Islam that we are in today and what our responsibilities are and what we need to do today. And we have discussed that Islam being portrayed as one that was spread by the sword, and we have discussed the creation of sects in Islam. Today we want to look at another very important aspect, and that is the general perception of Islam, which is a negative one in the contemporary times. As we all know, a very big majority of the people in today's times perceive Islam to be a violent religion. There have been many surveys and feedbacks, especially in the Western countries, to look into this particular aspect. And they come up with certain facts, or rather certain responses, that are very scary. In one such survey, to measure the public perception of ethnicity and immigration, this was done very recently after the influx of the Syrian refugees, especially in Europe as well as in America. The findings of this survey is very similar to very many others, and something that we need to not only be aware of, but rather need to ponder on how to counter it. Before we even look at the statistics and results of such a survey, there is a very important aspect that we also need to realize and be conscious of. Many Western countries are very tolerant and open in many ways, much contrary to very many Muslim countries in the world. We are free to observe our religion. We are free to practice our religion, which is not true in many Muslim countries today. There are many positive things that are available to us, and many programs also have been instituted to counter this Islamophobia as well. But that should not make us relaxed. We as individuals as well as collectively as a community need to be very cautious and need to take responsibility as well. This survey that I am talking about is talking specifically about the image of Islam and Muslims that people have in the Western world in general. And to answer a question about how people see and which is the religion that is viewed likely as the most violent, Islam stands out first, followed by Sikhism, third is by Christianity, fourth is Hinduism, fifth is Judaism, and finally Buddhism. This is the order in which people have responded. And there is an epidemic of Islamophobia specifically in the American society, and suggests that less than one third of the people have any positive image of Islam and Muslims. More than half feel that it is the mainstream doctrines of Islam that promote violence. Our general reaction normally is, this whatever is happening is a fringe element, it will die out itself. Sometimes we also say this is all just media propaganda and soon it will be over. We cannot ignore the fact that more than half of the people feel that it is Islamic doctrines that promote violence. We acknowledge and agree that groups like ISIS, Daesh, Al-Qaeda, Taliban have played a major share in distorting the true image of Islam. However, living in the West, it puts us into a position of greater responsibility than in other places. It is us who need to change this perception. And it is a burden upon this Muslim community that lives in the West to bring about that change of perception. So how do we do it? There are two major issues and factors that we must always have consciously in our minds, and whenever there is any form of discussion, even at individual levels, these two issues must be brought again and again all the time. And that is, firstly, to remember that we Muslims are ourselves a vast majority of victims of this violence. We must keep on saying this all the time, that is committed by these so-called Islamist groups. But the Muslims are the biggest victims. And secondly, we also need to emphasize that the governments in the region where these groups flourish are all allies of the Western governments. The financiers and all of them, and this is a matter of its own and it's not for discussion here at this time. It is our governments and support of financial as well as political support that is given to such Islamic groups, so-called Islamic groups, that have created havoc in the world. And this must be said. Let us look at a quick example to understand what this means. When we look at the recent tragedy that happened in Nice, France, we see a truck driver who is supposedly to be a Muslim, driving into a crowd on a national holiday in France. Of course, this is a tragedy and must be condemned. However, when we look at the toll of fatalities that happen, 35 out of 84 people who died in that tragedy were Muslims. So this person who claims to be working for Islam never thought about these things, and it was not an Islamic thing that he did. When we look at the presence of Muslims in the West, now let us look again on this Nice thing. This Imam tells us, there is an Imam of a particular mosque who says that I am busy preparing for funerals of the people who have been affected, consoling and counseling the families who are in anger and want to be consoled. We see, and he asks, he says, it hurts me. This is his statement. He says, it hurts me when people tell me to go back to where I came from. A common slogan that is being used in the West today. Go back to where you came from. He says, I was born in France. I was educated in France. I grew up in France. What do I need to finally tell the people that I be accepted by people as a French? In our casual discussions also, we should not take this matter lightly, mu'mineen. We should not trivialize by saying, oh, this friend of mine or this co-worker of mine or this neighbor of mine simply brings about these things which are Islamophobic and I should ignore it this time. That is not the right attitude. We need to let them know the reality. It is not that one person that you are talking to. He as a person has a family, has family friends, he has friends, he has circles that he goes to, and whenever such things will come up in those platforms or discussions, he will remember what we have said. It may seem a trivial thing and we may use it to ignore it, but it will go a long way. However, there are do's and don'ts in how to approach this. So what is it that we need to do? Based on two issues that we have discussed, that we tell people that we are the victims and that our governments are allied to those governments which promote and where these groups flourish. We need to always only bring facts and not harp upon conspiracy theories, because conspiracy theories become a non-starter straight away. And this is not the correct way. The way to understand is we need to realize that we are having a dialogue. And not every pill is a remedy for every sickness. For example, what we do in an interfaith dialogue is different from what we speak in an intrafaith dialogue. These are two different levels and two different approaches have to be made. And therefore, even in this, we have to be very careful in how we are approaching and speaking to the other person. So we come to a very important aspect, the Ambassador of Islam program that we have instituted. Mu'mineen, before we even go into the program and the pros and cons of the program, we need to say that we as a Muslim, being a believer in Islam, are the face, whether we like it or not. We are the ambassador of Islam. Each one of us is a face of Islam to the other. They know Islam through us. And therefore, there are certain things that we need to understand, which we will look from next week, inshallah, which have been taught to us by none other than our sixth Imam, Imam Jafar Sadiq Salawatullahi wa salamu alayhi, on how to approach these things and how to understand and be within society so that we are the real ambassadors of Islam. This is not a mere slogan. We should neither be afraid that we are looking at this program, that it will be something that I cannot do, and the responsibilities that are so wide I cannot undertake, nor should we look at it that it is something that will be a tool for my self-elevation or something that will make a name for me or promote my popularity. This is not that program. This program is to represent Islam correctly. And the only way to counter Islamophobia is to represent Islam in its right perspective. And since we are the Shias of the Ahlul-bayt alayhimus salam, it becomes our responsibility to portray the real Islam and the real image of Islam to the public. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the tawfiq to be the real ambassadors of Islam, implement the teachings of the Ahlul-bayt alayhimus salam in our lives. Ameen ya Rabbal Alameen. Inna Allaha wa malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu sallu alayhi wa sallimu taslima. اللهم صل على سيد المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين نبينا محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وعلى إمام المسلمين وقائد الغر المحجلين أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب وعلى سيدة نساء العالمين وبذة خاتم النبيين سيدتنا فاطمة بنت رسول الله وعلى سبط الرحمة وإمامي الهدى الحسن والحسين سيد شباب أهل الجنة وعلى أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي عليهم الصلاة والسلام. اللهم صل على مولانا صاحب الزمان ما هي آثار البدع والطغيان هادم ابن شرك والنفاق حاسدي فروع البغي والشقاق صلوات الله وسلام عليه وعلى آباء الكرام وما اتصلت الليالي والأيام. اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه وخل ناذرنا بنظرة منا إليه واجعلنا من المستشهدين بين يديه وتفضل على أمرائنا المؤمنين بمزيد التوفيقات وازدياد الأقبال وألوف الدرجات. اللهم افعل بنا ما أنت أهله ولا تفعل بنا ما نحن أهله بجاه محمد وآله المعصومين صلوات الله عليهم أجمعين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر.